you took your time. You didn't dip a toe, but you did wade in to like waist deep. And you're like,
Okay.
let me make sure.
Yeah,
Let me
yeah.
just make sure that I have my footing here before I go all in. But once you were in, you're like, okay, there is enough scientific evidence around these subjects. And it isn't an or, science or religion or spirituality. It's an and.
Yes.
And we dive into that on a regular basis because it's often, is it this or this? And it's like, no, almost always, it's and.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
that's the point of the realm of potentiality. It's infinite. And so all of those potentials exist simultaneously. And since there are so many of us here on this planet, we're literally pulling down all of the options in some fashion or some way. So generally there's an and, because one of us might pull down one of us might pull down the other. And so now both are existing simultaneously, even in the material world.
Yes.
And so it's an
Yes.
and.
Yes. Yes. I always use the word both,
Yeah.
because it's it's always, do you want A or B? I want both,
Yeah.
For the longest time, I've always wanted both. I didn't want to have to choose between one or the other, which is interesting, Like that's part of that intuitive understanding, those signposts. And that's what I start realizing as I go is there's hundreds of signposts throughout my life that showed me I was on the right path, yeah, yeah, and both, whatever word you want to use. And what comes to mind is, you talk about the amount of people on this planet, let alone maybe life in the universe. But let's start with this planet, 7.5 billion people. I mean, I feel like nowadays it seems like everybody wants all humans to have one experience that everybody can get on board with and get behind. And it's like, why would you create 7.5 billion people to all have one single experience? Why
And
wouldn't
how
you?
boring would it be if we
Right?
did?
Like, what's the point? Especially when you start to better understand the nature of consciousness and its purposive evolution, its purpose for existing, its purpose for creating, right? Like, there's no way it wants one single experience with the diversity that we see out there, right?
So how would you define consciousness from what you've gained through all the studies? And I know we were founded in what was being brought forward through the program we studied, but we've also done a lot of studies outside of it. And we're constantly sharing things back and forth with each other. So with all that you've kind of stepped outside of your box and have now studied, what would your definition of consciousness be for you?
Well, it's still, I'm more likely to parrot some things that point me in a direction, right? Because I don't know that I know what my definition of consciousness is. And in our conversation, I suspect I already do, because you wouldn't ask me that if I didn't know, and I just haven't been able to formulate the words and haven't written it down. So, but I think, and I'm aware that we're in a podcast as well. And so I want to put a differentiating factor in here too, that I used to think consciousness was an epiphenomenon of the brain. So that it was something that matter in my brain cells, my neurocircuitry, the brain, everything that happens in the brain, all of a sudden creates what we've called consciousness. And now there's this entity of consciousness that identifies as Corey, right? And so now, with Goswami's school of thought, he says consciousness is the ground of all being. Well, okay, great. What does that mean? Well, it means that everything's created from consciousness. Everything's created from consciousness. Matter comes from consciousness. So that's an aspect of consciousness. Consciousness has also created other levels of existence besides material. And so in our QAV program, we talk about 5 levels of experience, I guess, is probably the right word. And we all have thoughts, right? We all have feelings. We all have some sort of intuition, and we all have a physical body. And then we talk about bliss as being the 5th. But all of those are ways that consciousness can experience reality. Now, then there is the aspect of my brain, and what does my brain do with consciousness? I think my brain filters a version of consciousness that I identify with as Corey. And so it takes that infinite, unbounded phenomenon. I don't know, like that's what was before the Big Bang. I don't know, right? Like it's I don't know what word I don't have good words to describe that. But it takes that infinite potential and it filters it in a way that I can have an effective human experience in this lifetime. There you go.